Hello YouTube, how you doing? Um, Today I'm going to do a video about how food has historically been used as a weapon. Alright, so during warfare, all throughout history, whether you're talking about Carthage, whether you're talking about Rome, Greece, Egypt, the Civil War, food has always been used as a weapon. And one of the tactics that the enemy has always used is a tactic of trying to prevent their enemy from eating. This could consist of anything. This can consist of ruining the water supply. This can consist of burning the fields, the provision grounds. This consists of all kinds of things. And this has been going on ever since the beginning of time. And what has happened in those historical events where the enemy has tried to make sure that their enemy is not eating and has used food as a weapon, it's no different than what's going on today. I mean, if you even really think about it, there are like, if you go all the way back to our ancient ancestors, or you don't even have to go back to our ancient ancestors. If you go back 100 years, people actually produced their own food and they did it for themselves. During the age of the hunter-gatherers, they went hunting and they knew how to produce their own food. The agriculturalists, during the agricultural revolution, they produced their own food. Even in more recent times, a lot of even sharecroppers, like before in the 1950s and 60s, they produced their own food. So you have a lot of people that have historically always produced their own food, and now all of a sudden we live in a society where people do not have knowledge of how to produce their own food. And it's not a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence at all. I mean, there's certain, you really think about it, there are certain city ordinances that make it illegal for people to catch rainwater. There are certain city ordinances that make it illegal for you to own chickens. There are certain city ordinances that make it illegal for you to have plants that produce seeds, or even to go to the grocery store and buy fruits that have seeds in them. You've seen it. You've gotten those watermelons that are completely void of having seeds. That is unnatural. And if you think that this is an accident, then I think you must be highly mistaken, because your enemy wants to be able to control your food supply. And at any moment, when you as an individual decide you want to get out of line and stand up for what it is that you think is right, that enemy is going to find a way to cut off that food supply. And if you don't have the ability to produce for yourself and understand how to produce for yourself, then you're screwed. What are you going to do? I mean, when you really think about it, the whole concept is trying to get human beings dependent upon systems instead of being dependent upon God and nature. See, God gives you this thing. God gives you the greenery. God gives you the rain. God gives you the water. God gives you the plants and the seeds. And these things naturally reproduce themselves over and over and over again. But no, now we live in a world where the system wants to control the reproduction of seeds. The system wants to control the reproduction of water. The system wants to control these things because they want to be able to feed you. They want you to be dependent upon the system. And see, and it kind of reminds me of when I was working on my dissertation in Dominica. All right, there was a story. There was the island of Dominica, is a Caribbean island, and in the 1760s, once the British had taken over the island, the British started to import a massive amount of slaves from Africa into that island. But these slaves were rebellious. They had risen up, they had killed their masters, and they fled into the interior of the island. In the interior of the island of Dominica, these formerly enslaved Africans started to produce farms, provision grounds, for miles and miles and miles in the interior, because they knew what was up. They knew that if they were going to try to survive independent of their former masters, they had to recreate a society that they were accustomed to in Africa. And that was a society where they used to actually produce their own food crops for themselves. And so they resisted for about 50 years. All right. Now, if you fast forward to about the year 1804, there were natural disasters that afflicted Dominica. There was an earthquake, and there were 2 really strong hurricanes that passed through. Now, when you think about the Maroons in the interior of Dominica, they actually had a great degree of independence compared to the average person that lived on the coast. Even the slave masters in the colonial upper British class on the coastal parts of Dominica were still dependent upon food coming from the outside, being shipped in from either other colonies or being shipped in from Britain or being shipped in through some other type of trade, right? And the slaves were also dependent upon that same system because the slaves got their food from their masters. Now, the Maroons, the runaway slaves that lived in the interior of Dominica, they did not have that same dependency. So when the ship hits the sand in Dominica and you had those natural disasters that ruined everything, that ruined food all throughout the coastal regions, the Maroons that lived inside of the mountains did not have this same dependency. And guess what this did? This gave them a certain degree of power and leverage over the people on the coast, especially the enslaved. So what they started to do is they started to create these secret networks with the enslaved populations on the coast. And the enslaved populations on the coast started to exchange salt, tools, gunpowder, guns for all the food provisions that the Maroons in the interior had been stockpiling for a very, very long time. So what you end up having was this alliance between the Maroons that were living in the mountains and then the enslaved population that was living on the coast. And you would often find the enslaved populations living on the coast in the interior, and you would often find the Maroons from the interior on the coast. And it got to the point where the colonial powers of Dominica, the British, were very concerned that Dominica might actually turn into another Haiti, because that's how lawless they had become. But it was the fact that they were growing their own food in the interior of the island that gave them that strength and that leverage and that power when dealing with their enemy. Because if you can't feed yourself, then how the heck can you defeat somebody? How can you defeat your enemy who's feeding you? Anyways, I'm going to end on that note. And remember, guys, the revolution would not be pesticides.